Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is another video in our YouTube series to help you improve your chess game. One of the big skills in chess is criticality assessment. What is criticality assessment? Criticality assessment is looking at a position and determining how critical is it that I find the right moves in this position. So in that sense, the word critical obviously means the same kind of thing it means in English. The definition can be more exact when we look at the computer evaluations of the position. We can say if there are move or moves that determine the outcome of the game by not finding them or finding them, then they become critical. For instance, if you're in the end game, let's say you're in a position where you have 30 legal moves and 2 of them win, 5 of them draw, and 23 lose. Well, if you're trying to win the game, which you should be if you have 2 winning moves, then finding one of those 2 winning moves is critical. If you don't find them, then if your opponent plays perfectly, you won't win. Let's say you only have 1 winning move. Then if you can't find that winning move, then that affects the outcome of the game, and that's a critical position. Now, earlier in the game, it's not so easy to figure out, but you can tell by listing the top 10 moves the computer gives. If the computer gives the top 10 moves in a position, and let's say the best move gives you a 0.2 advantage and the 10th best move gives you a 0 even position, then that's not a critical position, because anything between the first move and the 10th best move, the difference is only 2/10 of a pawn. So, if you're playing Petrosian or Karpov, you want that 2/10 of a pawn, obviously. But if you're a normal player, and even grandmasters don't make the absolute best moves, then it doesn't much matter if you pick out the 4th best move and you're up 0.14 instead of up 0.2 with the best move. There's no way a human would be able to tell that anyway. And even the people who program the computers are going to tell you that the error in the evaluation of the computer is down around that level anyway. So your 4th best move might be just as good as the best move. So you have this idea of criticality assessment. Now, when you're playing a game, you don't know any of this stuff. You can't stop the game and ask the computer to evaluate the position, because then the computer is going to tell you what the right moves are, and that's cheating anyway. So you have to be able to tell by looking at the position. One of the best ways to tell that a position is critical is if it's complicated. Another way to tell if a position is critical is if you have a lot of choices. For instance, if you have a lot of different captures you can make, or if you have multiple recaptures, that's a tip-off that it probably is a critical position. I have in front of me the book Chess Rules of Thumb by Lev Albert and Al Lawrence. And in their rule of thumb number 135, they say recognize 5 characteristics of a critical position. So let me read you their 5. Number 1 is when the game changes from known theory into unknown territory, from opening to middle game or from middle game to end game. Number 2 is when any pieces are exchanged, especially queens. Number 3, when there is any change or possible change in the pawn structure, especially in the center. Number 4 is when you have a tactical short-lived advantage which will disappear if not exploited now. And number 5 is when you see a move which seems to win. I always tell people, that's a flashing red light. Anytime you see a move that seems to win, that's not a flashing green light that says play fast. That's a flashing red light. It's critical. And his next, in the book, Albert and Lawrence's next principle is a critical position is one about which you should think long and hard. All right, well, I don't 100% agree with their list of 5, but it's still a very good list. And if you don't have any idea what a critical position is, this helps a lot. So when you have these recaptures, or you have changes in the pawn structure, or you have possible multiple captures, or you see any kind of complications, where you see a move that seems to win, these are critical moves. And those are the moves you need to take more time on. How much time? Well, that depends on the time limit of the game and how much time you have left on the clock and how critical and how late in the game it is and all those kind of things. For instance, if you go back to my very first video on our channel, I give an extremely critical position that's very deep in the end game. And if you get that position right for the right reason, you'll understand that if you get the right move, you're winning the game. And if you don't get the right move, you're not. And in that kind of position, if you have 20 minutes left on your clock and you take 19 minutes on the move, that's okay, because once you figure out what the winning move is and you can play it, then you should be able to, if you have any kind of increment, let's say, even a 5-second increment, you should be able to mate with a king and a queen against a king if you could figure out that that's the line that's going to get you promoted and the other lines don't. So you have all these possibilities for criticality assessment. I thought I'd pick kind of a random game. I went to the US Championship from a few weeks ago, and I took out the game Ramirez-Xiong. And let's look at the game from a criticality eye and see which moves are critical and why. And we can even stop and we'll test me. I'll say this looks a little bit critical, and then we'll turn on Stockfish and see if Stockfish agrees with me. All right, so let's see what the game was. When you're playing book moves, the only thing that's critical is that you make sure that it really is a book move and it's the move that you want to play. Don't reach out and touch the wrong piece. All right, so we have a Sicilian, and we have a c3 against the d6 variation. So normally here, black plays knight f6 and hits the e-pawn. And he does. He's not really threatening to take it because queen a4 check would win the knight. So white doesn't have to guard her right now. But let's see. And it's interesting. Both sides have used a little time. But again, the time isn't official here because they weren't playing on the ICC. This is just the ICC relay. All right, so white decides to guard the pawn anyway with queen to c2. Queen c7. g3, white decides to fianchetto the bishop. b6, bishop g2, bishop b7 hits the pawn. Now I'm expecting white to play d3 and slow play it a little bit. And he does. Black says, I'm going to undermine that pawn. So, all right, so now this is getting a little bit critical. It's still early in the game, but if white takes the pawn, and black either takes back with the queen and hits this pawn 3 times and it's only guarded once, or more likely if white takes the pawn and black takes the e-pawn, then black's got really good play there. So white probably has to play something that guards the e4 pawn. He'd have to play something like knight bd2 or knight fd2, something like that. Let's see what white does. He takes the pawn. All right. So, as we said, this isn't losing a pawn. It just looks critical that you want to allow that. I would guess the difference between those moves is, maybe a tenth of a pawn or something. Let's see. Stockfish, what's the difference between the top 2 moves here for Grandmaster Ramirez? All right, so he's saying that the move that Ramirez played in the game, d takes c4, is minus 0.24, and knight bd2 is better, but they're jumping around. So it's not, it doesn't look as critical as I thought it might be. At this point in time, knight d4 gives white a minus 0.07, d takes c4 is minus 0.3, so there's a difference of about maybe 0.2. That's not super critical, but it's certainly something Ramirez would have to think about. All right, let's turn off the computer. We'll bring it back on when we need it. All right. So Ramirez did take over a minute on that move. So obviously in a 25-minute game, he thought it was a little bit critical. All right, and black takes there. Now I would expect white to play like knight on... Well, no, he can play knight on b to d2 because he's hitting the queen, and the queen can't take the pawn because the knight will be guarding it. So I'm expecting maybe knight bd2 here. And he does. And black just puts the queen back on c7. So now the pawn is adequately guarded. White should just castle. And he does. I always try to get my students to do that. They're always coming up with reasons why they shouldn't castle. I had about 6 different lessons this week where my students didn't castle when they should have castled. And it was positions like this where you don't have anything better to do, but they figured, well, I can always castle later, and maybe that loses a tempo, or I should develop. Castling is a developing move. It's the only move that develops 2 pieces in one move, and it gets your most important piece out of the middle where it's in danger. So it's not really that hard. I bet Ramirez didn't take much time on this move. Let's take a look. Right, in fact, his clock went up, which is impossible with a 5-second increment. He can't go up by 2 minutes. So that's they fixed the relay. That's all that's happening there. But he probably played that move almost instantly. All right, black develops the knight. He wants to maybe put more pressure on the e4 pawn. White overprotects the e4 pawn with the idea that black's going to be attacking it some more anyway. Black says, I got a couple pawns in this diagonal. Let's develop the bishop by fianchettoing. Those are not critical moves. a4, black's going to say, all right, you can play a5 if you want, but I'll probably just fianchetto my bishop, and he does. Black wants to get castled now also. White plays a5. That's not technically a break move because black can go past it with b5, which he probably wouldn't do, because white could play something like a6 and hit the bishop, or white could just play, well, I don't think he'll play b4. That makes his c-pawn backward. But I don't think he's going to play b5. Yeah, he plays rook a, c8. White might take the pawn now with the idea of isolating these pawns. He does. Black has a choice of taking with the queen or the pawn. Better probably to take with the pawn and bring it toward the middle and not have that pawn as a target on the semi-open A file. Pawn takes. Is that a critical move? Well, he has three ways to take the pawn, and when there's a recapture, it's probably a fair difference. Let's take a guess. My guess again is the difference between the best move to the worst move here is going to be a little more than 0.2. That's not super critical, of course, but let's see if I'm correct. Let's have Stockfish evaluate the top three. All right, so it's certainly more than 0.2. Taking with the knight, well, you can't take with the knight because that doesn't guard the A pawn. So really it's between taking with the queen and taking with the pawn. But you can see there's a pretty big difference. If you take with the queen, the difference just jumped way down. That's interesting. It was a much bigger difference a couple ply ago. Now Stockfish is saying it's not such a big difference. By the way, that's a good point. If you can't tell the difference, then it's like driving a car defensively. If you can't tell if a move is critical or not, you have to treat it at least as a little bit critical, because if you absolutely assume it's not critical at all what you do, and then it turns out it is, that can cost you a lot. So on the other hand, if you assume it's critical and it turns out it's not that critical, it'll just cost you a little time on your clock. Now, of course, if you're one of these people who plays way too slow and you assume every move is super critical, that's not going to be good, because you don't want to assume every move is super critical. You'll get into unnecessary time trouble, and that will kill you just as much as making big tactical errors. So you don't want to do that. If you haven't seen my video on speeding up, I have a video for slowing down. I have a video for speeding up. If you're one of those people who plays too slow, I strongly recommend the speeding up video. All right, so Stockfish has been running for 30 ply here. Says the difference is only 0.06, so that's not very critical. I thought it might be a little more critical. My guess was 0.2. Wasn't quite up to that. All right, so pawn takes. Knight to d4. And some lines white would like to stick that knight on b5 and AWL the queen, attack it with something worth less. Another video I made. Black's going to have to castle sooner here. First he moves the queen back. So that way the knight can not only can't attack the queen, but the rook can't come down and pin the bishop. But the queen is very little awkward there. Grandmaster Xiong, of course, is a very, very strong player. So I assume he's realizing that, you know, at some point maybe he'll break with d5 and open this diagonal for the queen. He'll get the queen back into the game pretty quickly. All right, so white just plays the strange move b3. I guess he's worried about moving the knight because he wants to guard the pawn, and maybe he wants to develop the bishop to b2 then. Maybe with the idea of playing c4 later and opening up that diagonal for the bishop. Both sides are down under 10 minutes already, which means they're playing this game pretty slow. Normally you don't want to play quite so slow in a 25-5 game. All right, so Grandmaster Xiong castles, and again his clock goes up by 2 or 3 minutes. That means the relay people are correcting the clock. You know, when they relay a game, the clocks are just not right, and eventually they get relays of the actual times and they fix the clocks. All right, white plays knight c4, tying down the knight on d7 to guarding the pawn on b6. Black says, I need to get this rook on f8, doing something. I'll play rook e8. Maybe I can break the center with d5 and e5. White says, no, you're not going to move that e-pawn anywhere because I've got your d-pawn under surveillance. Black says, oh, look, I can play a neat sacrifice here. I can sacrifice my knight, and then I can take this knight, and when he takes back, I can push a pawn, and this knight will be pinned to the queen, and I'll get it back. All right, is that the best move, and how critical is it that Grandmaster Xiong finds it? Well, let's ask Stockfish. Stockfish, is knight takes e4 a good combination, and how important is it to find it? Stockfish says black's best move is knight to c5, and he would be up about 0.4. Second best move is d5. So far, knight e4 is not even one of the 4 best moves. Now we're showing the top 6 moves. Knight takes e4 doesn't make them. Top 7 moves, still no knight takes e4. Let's go to the top 10. Top 10, knight takes e4, not there. Now the difference between number 10 and number 1 is only 0.45, which is not super big. And most of that 0.45 comes in the gap between number 3 and 4. So here, it's kind of critical that Grandmaster Xiong find one of the top 2 moves to give him about a half pawn advantage. Once he plays moves 3 through 10, it's a lower difference. Sort of number 3 is in the middle here, but number 4 through number 10 doesn't matter that much. So let's play knight takes e5 and see what the evaluation says. So he was up about 0.4, 0.5. Let's make this bigger so you can see it. And knight takes e4. Wow, look at that. So white's advantage now, if he takes with the rook, is 2, and if he takes with the bishop, the advantage is only, it's about even. So here, this is a super critical move. Grandmaster Ramirez has to figure out that if he takes with the rook, everything's going fine, and if he takes with the bishop, then black kind of gets away with murder here. So Grandmaster Ramirez needs to take a little time. Now, you might say, well, you shouldn't take with the rook. It's worth more than the bishop. Well, but you are winning 2 pieces for a rook to start with, and if you're not losing a piece at the end of it, because you could take with the rook and that doesn't open up this line against the queen, then it's better to win 2 pieces for a rook than it is to win a piece and then lose a piece later. And that's basically what Stockfish is trying to tell us. So Grandmaster Ramirez does figure that out, but look how much time it took him. If his clock is correct, and we know that these clocks aren't 100% correct, it took him 6 minutes out of his 8 minutes to find it. Well, is that worth it for Grandmaster to take 6 out of 8 minutes to play a move which is 2 pawns higher rated? And the answer is probably. He's got a 5-second increment. If he can survive this and end up 2 ahead, he can probably play fast and do okay. Let's see what Grandmaster Xiong makes out of this position now. Grandmaster Xiong takes the exchange, and white takes back with the queen, which, as we said, if you have 2 ways to take back, taking with the bishop, as we said, is a mistake, because then bishop takes, pawn takes, b5, and he wins a piece. That would be disastrous. So he wants to take with the queen to get it out of the pin. That he does right away, and you can see his clock goes up 4 minutes when the relayer fixed the time. All right, so now black's in some big trouble here. Let's see what happens. And the clocks are about even. So we got to bet on white here. Although I know Grandmaster Xiong had a good tournament, so hard to believe he ended up losing this game. But right now, if both sides play perfectly, he probably should lose. He plays knight c5. The queen should move. Is it critical where it goes? Well, it's not super critical. If you have a difference of a half a pawn, then the difference between being even and being up a half a pawn is a big difference. But if you're up 3 pawns, the difference between being up 3 or being up 3.5 is not as critical as the difference between being up 0 and 0.5. So the absolute number difference is not always what's important. It's where you are in the evaluation scale. If you're already winning easily, if you're up 10 pawns and you lose a pawn and you're only up 9 pawns, okay, well, you're still winning easily. But if you're up 1 pawn and you're pretty much close to winning and you lose a pawn and now you're 0 and you're dead even, that's really critical. All right, so white plays queen to e3, and Stockfish says that doesn't work because black can play knight takes, and then rook takes c4 and remove the guard. So what he should have done is move the queen somewhere where that combination doesn't work, like queen to b1 to guard this pawn, or queen to c2. So Grandmaster Ramirez blunders, and it's probably because he took a little bit of time and now he wanted to play faster, but he plays too fast. And Grandmaster Xiong says, thank goodness I'm back in the game. It's critical, of course, that Grandmaster Xiong finds this move. It's a difference of about 1.4. And it's the difference between being down only 0.9 versus being down 2.2. That's an enormous difference from a standpoint of possibilities of winning the game. So he finds the idea. He takes the knight. Now he's hitting this pawn. White has a couple ways to save it. He plays knight d4. Black plays b5. White plays bishop d5. And there, Stockfish says, not a great idea. Much better idea to hit the rook would be to hit it this way. He hits the rook that way. And now rook a4 would pin the bishop. And it does. Now the game is back to about even. White should play queen d3. In fact, here's a critical... Well, how critical is it? Right now, if White finds the best move, queen d3, he's 0. If he finds the second best move, he's minus 0.6. So that's fairly critical that Ramirez finds queen d3. He plays bishop b3. Now, if Black can find that rook a6 is the best move, that'll give him a big advantage, and Grandmaster Xiong does that. Now we're seeing a few moves ago it was +2. Now it's all the way down to minus 1.3. White plays knight c2. Now Black can start piling up here. Queen a8 or queen a7. He plays e6 first to free up the rook and block the bishop's diagonal. White gets out of the pin while he can. Stockfish says e6 was a pretty big mistake, but, you know, when both sides are short on time. Now it says it's back to even. Queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes pawn. Stockfish said bishop b4 was a little better. Bishop takes c3. Rook b1. Rook hits the bishop. Is it critical where the bishop goes? At least not for the top two moves. Bishop f4 and bishop c5 are about equally good. So as long as he finds one of these moves, which he does, he's okay. The rook's double. Knight a3 as good as anything. b4. Knight c4. Stockfish said knight b5 was better. Rook a7. Now king f1 is the best move. White's down by about 0.3. He finds the move. This next move doesn't look too critical. Let's show the top 3 moves instead of the top 2. Yeah, you can see how close this is between these 3. So as long as you find a reasonable move here for Grandmaster Xiong, it's not critical. He can play quickly. He decides to trade rooks, which when you have 2 rooks against 1, sometimes that's a good plan. Bishop takes. King comes to the middle. So again, it's close to equal here. Both sides are playing quickly. And that move. So here, it's critical that White find either knight d3 or knight c4. Every other move loses, -4. Knight d3, knight c4 has to be played. King d3. Now Black can play g5. Why is g5 so good? It looks like you're just losing a pawn. Well, you have to watch out for skewers here. You have to watch out for forks, which doesn't work quite yet. But if Grandmaster Xiong has a good tactical eye here and sees the g5, of course, the idea of g5 is just removal of the guard on the knight. That's not the kind of thing that Grandmasters would miss with a minute left on their clock. You know, the knight is guarded only by the bishop. The bishop has no other moves on the diagonal. So therefore, g5 is going to remove that guard and win the game. That's why he had to move the knight on the previous move, to stop the removal of the guard, but in time trouble, he misses that. Okay, so Black plays g5, and White probably said to himself, oh, darn, I missed the tactic. So now things are over. Black's going to win. White's going to try to get the best he can. And White doesn't even make a move. He just says, darn, resign. Okay, so hopefully this video gave you an idea. I have another video on criticality. I have a few videos on my channel, if we go to my channel and we search across the channel for criticality, that's how you search on the channel. Criticality and time management in the end game. Criticality. So we have critical moves and critical decisions from July 30, 2019. That was my first video on criticality, similar to this one. Evaluation criteria, discusses position evaluation, blah, 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 has criticality. Stronger player plays critical moves better is a video, amateur game. And criticality and time management in the end game, September 6th. So you can find criticality by searching on my channel, just like that. Okay, let's close that off, and we'll go back to my board. Okay, so criticality assessment is a really important skill in chess. It helps you manage your time. It helps you figure out whether which kind of moves are your candidate moves and how important they are. It helps you figure out, how you're going to not only allocate your time, but which moves are the ones you're going to really give more emphasis to. It just is a really important skill. Helps you find tactics, helps you look for things in the position that are important. And if those things important turn out to be the differences in the game or the differences in that position, then those are the things that are critical. Those are the things that you want to put emphasis on. And as I said, sometimes it's as simple as which way should I recapture? We saw where black had a takes b6 versus queen takes b6. We didn't know how critical it was. Turned out it wasn't that critical, but we don't know that when we're playing a game. When you have those recaptures, don't just make recaptures quickly. Take your time and try to figure out what's the best recapture. I see a lot of my students, they make these automatic recaptures even though they have multiple possible recaptures. Or if somebody takes your piece and you have to take a piece back, sometimes you don't have to take the piece that took you first. You can take a piece somewhere else on the board, and that will also be a safe move. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's silly, but those are the kind of critical things you have to look at. All right, again, if you have not told your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, here on YouTube, please do that. If you haven't subscribed and you'd like to subscribe, we have 150, whatever it is, 157 videos now, and growing, maybe about, one every week or so. So grab onto the channel. If you like the video, you can hit that like button. We'll see you next time. Bye.